So to start off for this project, you need to come up with a solid template design. It helps to even put that template together. I've cut out 4 identical sides to my piece, and I can actually put them together. Just a couple little pieces of tape, doesn't need to be too many, so that I can see what this piece is going to look like when it's finished. So once you've got your piece together, this will give you a pretty good idea of what that's going to look like when it's finished. And then, it didn't take me much time. I can go ahead and disassemble it and start putting the pieces together. Okay? Some things that you'll need for this project, tool-wise, you're going to want to do most of your work on the drywall board. This is where you're going to roll your slabs and do all your cutting and do all your assembling, things like that. You're going to want to have a sponge that you can just get damp and keep with you at your table. You're going to need a metal rib tool. This is going to be mostly used for smoothing out the surface of your slabs when you finish your rolling and you're getting ready to cut out your templates. I keep a needle tool with me usually at all times just because it's helpful for quick scoring jobs, or if I need to mark the clay or make reference marks for myself. X-Acto knife is what I'm going to be cutting with. I try to stay away from the regular wooden handled knives just because the X-Acto is a little bit more accurate and sharp. This clay we're going to use, it's going to be leather hard, which means it's dried out a little bit, so it's not as soft as when you first roll it. So I like an X-Acto knife for that. I also keep my wooden knife with me, mainly for this edge right here. I want this nice round edge to smooth out the inside corners of my project so there's no visible seams. And then probably the most important tool for this project is going to be one of these serrated scraper tools, because this surface here will help speed up your scoring about 100 times. So I could score with my needle tool, I could score with my X-Acto knife if I need to, but this is going to make my job go a lot faster. Now for this project, you're going to have to roll most of your slabs here at school. I don't have enough rolling pins for students to take them home, so you're going to have to do the rolling right here in the classroom and transport your slabs home. And then at home you can let them dry out a little bit. When I roll my slabs, we've done this before, I always like to prep my clay a little bit before I start rolling them out, just to get it into a block shape. And I'm just stretching this clay out. As I throw it, I'm trying to hit the back end of the slab first. Again, when you throw this down, you want to make sure you're hitting the back side of your slab first. Hit the back side first and let the front end stretch out as it lands. Pick it up, flip it over, and do the same thing again. Okay. I should also be paying attention to my template pieces. So I can start taking this apart and using these for cutting out my shapes. So when I roll this slab, I want to make sure that I'm rolling it with the least amount of scrap clay as possible. So if I roll it this way and stretch it out this way, I'm going to have a lot of clay left on top and bottom. So maybe I will paddle this back into shape a little bit. That looks better. Okay. I'm always going to make sure I'm using the wooden boards to determine my thickness, and then when I'm rolling, make sure you stand up, start in the middle of your slab, and push and roll all the way out past the end, then come back to the middle and do the same. Okay, I'm stopping here so I don't go off the board. Then flip your work, go back to the center, roll all the way out past the end, do the same there, and eventually you might have to rotate so that you can go long ways on the drywall boards. I also flip the slab and really try to find a dry spot as frequently as I can so that I don't end up getting the slab stuck to the surface of the drywall board. Okay, now I can go ahead and take my metal rib tool and smooth out the surface and get rid of all those cracks. Sometimes if my clay is a little bit on the dry side, I'll take just a damp sponge and I'll just wipe the surface with that damp sponge to put some moisture back into it. But in this case, I think my clay is plenty soft. I don't have to worry too much about it. Okay, this is required for all projects. Flip that over. Do the same on the other side. Now when I'm smoothing this out with the rib, just to see the technique, I have the rib at about a 45-degree angle, and I'm pushing down slightly to make it bend, and using the surface, or using the rounded edge to smooth things out. So at this point, you could leave your work and transport it home, or you could take your template and start cutting your shapes now. I think if you cut your shapes now, that requires less storage room at home. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these first. And I'm going to try to save as much space as possible and line these up. Doesn't look like I can get 3 of them on one, but I should be able to get 2 plus my bottom, and then I can cut out a new, or I can roll out a new slab to cut. Okay, I'll set these aside, and I need to roll 2 more slabs and cut them out. Now, if you've got enough clay left over that you can make an extra piece or an extra slab or an extra side or bottom, it's always a good idea to go ahead and do that. You might make a mistake on a piece working at home and need to restart something, and rather than having to wait till you come back to school to roll that out, it might be a good idea to have that with you. So, okay, so I've got all my pieces cut out. It's time for me to transport them home. I need to make sure that I get them home safely. So there should be enough extra boards that everybody in here can get an extra storage board. This is a great place to put your work. If your clay has just been rolled out and it's maybe a little bit soft, sometimes it could get stuck back to the board. So I always take just a sheet of paper towel and I set that down on the board to act as a release between the two. Okay. Now, if your work is sits like this for a while, it could get stuck together. So again, we're just making sure we have that paper towel there so that they don't. The other thing is it's not going to dry out if it's sitting like this either. Okay, so you need to make sure that when you're trying to dry these out, you take them off of the board and lay them out so they can all get an equal amount of air. All right. When you're taking these home, if you want, you could set up your tools here. But please keep in mind that you need to bring your tools back if you need them here. I don't quite have enough tools for everybody. And I've got a fairly big piece of plastic, so I'm going to fold it in half. And when I store this to bring home, I'm going to make sure that I tuck in all of the edges of the plastic so there's no openings. Okay? And then I can come back at the end of the day, grab this, take it with me, and leave it at home for the time being. Okay, now that I've gotten my work home, I need to set up my workspace. Hopefully you have a good place that you can keep these things and work on them when you're at home. But if you don't really have a great place, you can always just clean up after yourself and set it back up tomorrow or the next day. First thing I need to do is get these off my board, and I need to start letting them dry out so they're not so flexible. Because when I'm building and working with this sort of leather hard slab, if they're flexible and if I want to try to get straight edges, I'm not going to be able to do that. I want everything to stay nice and straight. I'm going to give these probably about an hour or so to sit out in the classroom. Everybody's workspace is going to be different. It all depends on how much air movement you have and how warm it is. If your thermostats are set a little bit on the cooler side, it might take longer. If you're doing this outside in a garage and maybe that garage is only partially heated and let's say it's 50 degrees in the garage, it's going to take longer, so you could bring these into the house to dry them. If you put a box fan by them, it'll speed up the drying significantly, but you run the risk of these cracking because they don't dry evenly. So if you were to do that, just make sure that you turn these every 5 minutes and you're babysitting them. Otherwise, you're going to end up with cracks in your work. Okay? So I'm going to let these sit, and I will come back and update on the next step. Okay, so we're back with our work that's dried out. I left these sit out for about an hour and a half. I checked them intermittently about every 30 minutes. And in the classroom here, it took about an hour and a half for them to get to a place where they're perfectly leather hard. So I can take the slab and I can hold it on end without it really collapsing on itself or bending. I can shake it a little bit. It pretty much keeps its shape, but it is flexible enough that I can just slightly bend it. If I bend any more than that, it's probably going to start to crack. So it's not a good thing to bend these. You don't want to do that. But just for the sake of showing you how dry they are, I just wanted you to be able to see that. Okay. Your next step is a very important step and is probably one of the harder steps for beginners to do well. And that is, we're going to cut miters into all of the connections for our pieces. So what I've done on this piece is I've cut a 45-degree angle on these three sides, and I've left this side as it was because that's going to end up being my top. So when this comes together, this is going to come together like this. Okay. Now we do miters because you'll get a better connection, and there's less likely a chance that your seams will start to crack. The other thing that I want you to remember to do before too late is to round the tops of these things so they don't look like they've been cut with a knife. Okay? All right, so when you're making your miters, the best thing to do is you're going to take 3 tools here. You need a good flat straight edge like a ruler. We're going to use the boards that we use to determine the thickness of the slab, and you're going to use an X-Acto knife to do the cutting. So the first thing that I do is I line, I'm going to do the 2 sides and the bottom, and I line this board right up on the edge of my slab, and I'm not cutting, I'm just going to score a little line. Okay? I do that a little bit darker so you can see it. I'm just scoring a little line. Your needle tool would work well for this. Okay, this line here should determine the same thickness on my slab here as it is here. And now I'll take my ruler, flat straight edge of some kind, and I'm going to line it right up on that same line and cut at a 45-degree angle. Now when I cut this, you won't be exactly 45 degrees, but a general rule that works well is just hold your knife at the same angle you would write with your pencil or pen. If you do that, it's pretty close to 45 degrees. And I'm going to hold down well on this so I don't move it while I'm cutting. Make sure my fingers get out of the way. And I should have a nice straight miter. Okay? So when you do this, my recommendation would be to do the same step over and over and over again. So I'm going to get all of these done. Then I'll go and cut them. Precision is important here. You want this to be exact. You're not winging this. If you get really, really good and you've done this a bunch, you can maybe do it without having to do the measurement with the wooden board first. You could maybe skip that part. I wouldn't recommend anybody freehand this because, again, we're going for quality. And I'm leaving the top of this. Okay? So this is a big step. I would do all this at one time. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of these pieces right now.
So one helpful tip that you can use when you're cutting these miters is you don't want to accidentally cut the top off of your slab and do a miter on the top. So sometimes it's helpful to put a little note right on the clay, either a T or a little X, to just remind yourself not to cut a miter on the top edge. If you cut a miter on the top edge, you might end up having to re-roll that slab.
Alright, so I've got my four sides are mitered, and I have one extra here just in case I'm going to need this. Okay. I also have two bottoms, one extra just in case I mess one up and I need an extra one. I don't do any miters on these yet. I wait until I'm ready to attach these because ultimately you might end up finding that you need to adjust the size of these first and then go ahead and miter. So I'm going to leave these as is. Okay. While I'm working, all of these pieces are drying out as they're sitting here, and I don't want them to get any worse. I can't let them dry out at all or else they're not really going to be workable. So I'm going to go ahead and put some of these away and just leave two out. As always, while you're doing this, make sure you're tucking in your plastic so things don't dry out on you. Okay. Once you've done the miters, you will have a lot of these little cut-off pieces. Okay. These you can just bring right back to school, and we'll end up putting these right back in the recycle buckets, and they can get recycled back out and run through the mixer. So you don't have to throw these away. Bring them back and we will recycle them. Okay, my next step is going to be to start assembling. So with these two miters, when I put the miters together, I end up with a 90-degree angle, or something hopefully close to it. Okay, being that it's a little bit handmade, it might not be a perfect 90-degree, but we can adjust things if we need to. Okay, I'm gonna have to do a better job of prepping these surfaces than I did last time, and I'll go over that here just in a second.
So these are the two edges that are going to come together when I score and slip. I'm going to use my serrated rib to do my scoring, which will help speed me up. And I'm going to grab some slip out of the cabinets and apply just with a brush. Make sure when you're doing the scoring that you use a little bit of pressure so that your score marks are not just on the surface. I always add a little bit of moisture with the sponge, and then I go back and score a second time. And I do that to both sides. Again, score, get it wet, rescore it. Once you've done the scoring, take your sponge and go in and smooth out that edge so you don't have any rough edges, rough spots, and make sure it's nice and straight again. Do that on both sides. The next step is going to be applying slip, and when you apply your slip, you want to get it on there just enough to fill in all your score marks. You don't need it to be dripping off the side of the piece or overflowing the sides. Just enough to fill in the score marks is plenty. After you've got the slip applied, you're going to want to go back and score it one more time on both surfaces. And this will help to make sure that you get a really nice connection for both pieces. Then one more time, take your damp sponge and smooth out that edge. So when you put it together, there's no rough spots. It's a lot better to do this now than once the piece is together. When you do the actual connection, you want to make sure you push together every little inch of the seam that you can. And you want to be careful not to make big dents in the surface of the clay as you're doing that. You might even notice that the slip comes out a little bit from the seam. If it does that, that's okay. And you can use a tool like this wooden knife tool or even your metal rib to smooth out that corner just a little bit. But don't worry about it too much. You'll come back and do that later once the piece has had some time to set up and that seam has time to heal. Now the next step is going to be, I've got to reinforce the inside of that seam. And I'm going to roll a little coil and attach that coil on the inside and smooth it out so the inside is smooth and round. So the perfect size for your coil is about the thickness of your X-Acto knife. If you leave your coil too big, you're going to have to smooth it out and blend it out too much on the inside of your seam. And if you leave it too small, it's not really going to be a reinforcement help. I also flatten it out just a little bit, and then I pinch a little corner on the top of it, and that corner is what's going to fit inside the corner of my two slabs. I just sweat the surface of that clay along the seam a little bit and do a tiny little bit of scoring, just enough to help the coil stick in the corner. I'll also take my sponge and just go over the coil one time to get it wet enough to stick. And then when you put this into the corner, you want to make sure that you're pushing down every little inch just like you did with the seam. And you want to be careful not to push so hard that you separate the seam on the other side. So I'm using my hand on the back side to hold that together. You also want to make sure you blend it. You can use a fingertip, you can use a tool. A little bit of water on the surface of that coil again might help to use your fingertips, or find the rounded edge of your wooden knife tool and go over it with that. Whatever you can find to make that inside edge round and smooth, and to get rid of the leftover edges from the coil. You want it to be blended in 100%. So the next step is to attach my bottom. Right now it's a little bit too big, so I'm going to take a little bit off so that it fits a little better. And I'm also going to just adjust my miter angle a little bit. It didn't quite line up how I needed it to, so I'm cutting it at a little sharper angle so it fits the miters underneath the two slabs a little better. And the reason I put the bottom piece on next is it prevents these two pieces from flexing back and forth. If that happens, it's usually likely they'll crack and start pulling apart as they dry. So just like in the previous slabs, I'm going to wet the surface of the miter a little bit before I score it. I'm going to make sure that I score with a little bit of pressure so that I have a good score mark and it's not too shallow. Get that surface wet and score it a second time. I just put the bottom on there to see if I like the fit, make sure it's big enough or it's not too small, and I'll do the same scoring to the bottom piece. Like always, I'm going back with my sponge before I do the attachment and make sure that those two edges are nice and smooth, and I'll do the same on the two slabs that I connected earlier. When I apply my slip, I want to make sure that I just put enough on to fill in those score marks. I don't want to put so much on that it's going to be oozing out when I do the attachment. And while you're working, all these little crumbs that you have on your board usually end up in the surface of your clay if you're not cleaning them up, so make sure to wipe those off your board and find a good place for them. This is a good example of too much slip. You don't want to use that much. If it's globbing on the surface like that, you need to get rid of some and use a little bit less. Now when I push these two edges together, I want to wiggle the bottom and the side together a little bit just to help make sure that those scored seams come together nicely. And I do the same thing on the other side. You might see your slip start coming out a little bit from the seam, and that's again just what you want. Just like I did on the seams previously, I'm going to wet and score the inside seams on the bottom and add some coils to reinforce that connection. Now because these have been sitting out for quite a while, it's a good idea to maybe just take a wet sponge and go over your seams to make sure they're not drying out too much on you, especially along the edges. If your slabs seem like they're feeling a little bit dry and they don't have any flexibility left, then go ahead and smooth out and wet the surface with your sponge as well. But at the very least, do the edges for your next connections.
Okay, this time I'm going to come back and finish up all the slabs that I had left. I gave this some time overnight so that these seams could solidify a little bit. There's no more wet slip. These corners I'm going to have to come back and clean up once I'm done with the project, and I'll do that at the very end. Okay. The other thing you need to pay attention to while you're working is just remember to keep a clean work surface so that when you're setting your piece down, you're not accidentally picking up little debris in the surface of the clay. You want to make sure that that stays nice and clean.
Don't forget, when you're scoring, it's always a good idea at this point to wet the surface of the connection first before you score it with your rib. Then go back in and wet it again and score it a second time before putting on your slip. Whenever you put on your slip, don't put so much on that it's dripping all over the place. You want to just put enough slip on there so that it fills in your score lines, and then go back and rescore it one more time. Doing all that extra scoring will really help to connect your seams and make them successful. When you're putting in the coils, don't forget to just wet that corner a little bit and maybe score it a little bit before you put the coil in. And then you want to try to get your coils as smooth and round as you can make them so that it doesn't look like there's a seam there. Now, as I'm about to put this piece on, it might not fit perfectly, and I might have to adjust some other walls or push the piece in to squish it in and fit into the corners. If you have to adjust a piece, go back and adjust it. Don't just assume it fits. If you have big gaps, you're going to have to fix that. Don't leave those gaps. They'll turn into cracks. And then finish out your coils on the inside. At this time, I'm going back and rounding out those edges at the top so they don't look like cut edges and they're smooth and round. Once your piece is done, you want to go back and make sure that you clean up all the sides and all the corners so that they're nice and smooth. A damp sponge and your rubber rib works best. You could also use your metal rib if you need to, but I generally recommend using the rubber one first and not using the metal rib unless you have a lot of extra clay you need to remove. I have a lot of extra clay that I wanted to get rid of, so I went back with the metal rib and just scraped some of that extra clay off, and then I can go back with the rubber rib again and smooth it out. So I put some images of some different foot ideas in here for you. This is just a simple 4 individual feet. Then I went a little bit further and made them angular. And then for my last one, I actually took my old bottom slab and cut out a complete square foot, which is going to be the one I'm going to attach.
So now I'm going to apply my foot that I made.
Now the only reason I didn't score the bowl is because I had all that wet slip on the surface.
Taking a little bit of a risk by just putting this in the wet slip. Hoping that that slip, when it dries, will hold that foot on. Now the tricky part is I've got to get this off of here without touching the outsides. So I haven't done any slip on the inside, and I know that I've got no slip on the foot, so I'm going to flip this over and get it on that foot without touching the outsides. And then push down just a little bit to make sure I've got a good stick. And it's done.